Hey everyone, today is Monday, September 7th. My name is Will, and these are my thoughts. Eddie Howe is not a household name in the United States, but I think he probably should be. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and assume that most of the people watching this don't know who Eddie Howe is at all, so let me take a minute for some background. Eddie Howe is an English soccer coach, or manager, who up until very recently was in charge of a club called Bournemouth. He actually had two different stints playing for Bournemouth in the mid-90s and 2000s, and then coached them two different times too. Weird. Anyway, Eddie Howe left Bournemouth at the end of last season, after being their manager for the past 9 years. Which is kind of wild to me, because he's only 42. Like, what am I doing with my life? Howe and Bournemouth agreed to mutually part ways after the club was relegated, which I have neither the time nor the desire to fully explain in this video. But the important thing is that at the beginning of this past season, his team were playing in the top division of English soccer. But next season, they won't be. And this is where I start to get frustrated. I see why Eddie would want to leave Bournemouth after last year. He's way too good of a manager to be in the second division. But the truth is that it could have turned out so differently for him. Like I said earlier, Eddie Howe managed Bournemouth for 9 years, during which time he did something that, in the landscape of English soccer, is borderline impossible. Bournemouth spent Howe's last year in England's top tier, but when he first got the job all the way back in 2006, they were in the 4th tier. For my baseball fans out there, that is roughly the equivalent of someone taking the Rocket City Trash Pandas, which is the real name of the Angels AA affiliate, by the way, all the way to the majors. Eddie Howe was their manager every time they got promoted, developing players like Ryan Fraser and Callum Wilson as he went. Until in 2015, they finally made it to the Premier League for the first time in Bournemouth's history. And for a while, that made him a pretty desirable young manager for the other teams in the top flight. Not only had he guided Bournemouth to 3 separate promotions over the course of a decade, but once they made it to the Premier League, they actually stayed there. Despite having a squad whose record signing was for just under £15 million, or to put that in perspective, about 12% of Paul Pogba, Bournemouth were doing the thing. They did enough to avoid being relegated in their first year, which is an accomplishment in and of itself. But the next year, in 2016-17, they finished 9th, inside the top half of the table, and above teams who had 2 or 3 times the money that Bournemouth did. And this ended up being the high watermark for Eddie Howe. He was connected with some of the biggest jobs in the division, including Arsenal, Tottenham, and Everton. And it all seemed warranted. He was a young English manager who'd done quite a lot with quite a little. Most teams that overachieve in England do so by hacking the other team to bits for 90 minutes. But Howe's Bournemouth weren't doing that at all. Watching them play was nice, even if they took a few on the chin every once in a while because of it. Then 2019 happened, and this is where I started to get even more frustrated. As teams around them kept outspending them and bringing in better players, Bournemouth started to slide down the table. Their defense was still pretty porous, but goals became harder and harder to come by, until eventually they finished 18th in the first relegation spot. There's actually a very good argument for them being screwed into that position by goal line technology, but that's another video for another time. Bournemouth being relegated is sad, but what I find sadder is what's happened to Eddie Howe because of it. When Everton fired Marco Silva in the fall, Howe's name was mentioned, only for him to be skipped over for the older, slightly shinier Carlo Ancelotti. And did that make sense at some level? Sure. Ancelotti's got a couple of Champions Leagues on Howe that are kind of hard to overlook. But I don't think that's why he didn't get the job. He was also on Tottenham's shortlist to replace Pochettino, but they ended up going with Jose Mourinho. And you can make the same argument for Mourinho that you made for Ancelotti, but I still don't think that's why he didn't get the job. In my opinion, Eddie Howe didn't get those jobs because people tend to prioritize the recent over the distant, and the big over the small. Pull off something miraculous in the right time frame? Great, you're hired. Something equally unlikely, but a few years ago? No thanks. Win something important as an underdog? Great, you're hired. Something small? No thanks. Eddie Howe is a victim of the zeitgeist. His resume warrants a bigger job. Hell, Arsenal hired a guy who has no first-team experience at all. And while that's worked out pretty well for them so far, it doesn't really help explain why Eddie Howe is in the position he is. And I'm not just making this video as an Eddie Howe apologist, which, I am one. But I think this is about way more than just him. I'm advocating for a shift in emphasis towards coaches in all sports who've done improbable things, and that potentially means moving away from the known. Every sport has its equivalent of Jeff Fisher, which is to say, a guy that just keeps getting jobs because you know what to expect from him. Lord knows English soccer has a few of those. But I would argue that every sport has at least a couple of Eddie Howes, too. We spend way too much time judging coaches' histories by their last chapter, and that just doesn't make any sense. Like, for the life of me, I don't understand it. By that same logic, Bill Belichick would have never gotten a job after his last year with the Browns. Don't give in to recency bias. Don't downplay someone's viability just because they were successful either slightly too long ago or not on the right stage. And for the love of God, don't let Eddie Howe be unemployed for that long. I'm Will, those are my thoughts, and I'll see you guys on Monday.